Hello, I'm Jacqui Webster from the George Institute for Global Health in Sydney. This research module is on cost effectiveness at scale. My research focuses on strengthening the impact of diet-related programs to address chronic diseases. I'm Chief Investigator on the GACD project on scaling up food policy implementation in the Pacific Islands, and I'm going to provide a brief overview of how we use economic modelling in our project. Then I'll hand over to Irene Deltetto from HT Analysts. She'll provide a more detailed overview about how to undertake cost effectiveness evaluation using an example from salt reduction work in Vietnam. Our current GACD project ends this year, and we have completed 2 economic analyses as part of this project. The first was on the health and economic benefits of different levels of sugar-sweetened taxation in Fiji. This used a proportional multi-state life model based on health-adjusted life years. The second used a social return on investment model to establish a business case for a salt reduction program in Fiji. Irene will discuss this in a bit more detail later. First, I wanted to explain how we use economic modelling to support scale-up research. This includes presenting to policymakers to influence policy uptake, or, in the case of sugar-sweetened beverage taxation, which is already in place in Fiji, to strengthen implementation. We use the economic modelling of salt reduction in Fiji to support a budget submission, as well as disseminating the results using the media. Other uses include demonstrating research impact and helping to justify future research. Most grant proposals will be strengthened by the inclusion of economic modelling, so it's important to understand and be aware of the different uses. I'll now hand over to Irene, who can provide a more detailed overview of how to approach cost effectiveness modelling. Thank you.
The focal point of health economics is decision making. This is because health resources are finite. They can't be stored or traded like other goods and need to be delivered immediately when they are needed. Another important factor is that over the past 50 years or so, the pace at which medicine and medical technologies have been delivered has been exponential. This has meant that the demand for healthcare and health services has far outpaced the growth in availability of resources. And as a result, payers must now choose what to fund and also decide how much they should pay for it. Cost effectiveness evaluation is a type of economic analysis used to compare the relative cost and outcomes or effects of different courses of actions in healthcare. It helps determine which interventions provide the best value for money by measuring the cost per unit of health benefit, often expressed in terms of quality adjusted life years or QALY, or disability life years or DALYs. Now we'll talk about those more in depth in a second. In healthcare decision making, cost effectiveness evaluation can play different roles. They can help policymakers and healthcare providers allocate limited resources efficiently by identifying interventions that offer the greatest health benefit for the least cost. They inform the development of health policies by providing evidence on cost effectiveness of different healthcare interventions, which can then guide decisions on funding and implementation. Cost effectiveness also support shared decision making between doctors and patients because they provide information on the cost effectiveness of different treatment options. They can be used in health technology assessments to evaluate new medical technologies and treatments to ensure that only those which are cost effective are actually adopted and funded. And then they can influence the pricing and reimbursement decision of healthcare payers, ensuring that the prices of these new treatments reflect their value in terms of health outcomes. So by integrating cost effectiveness analysis into healthcare decision making, stakeholders can make more informed choices that really maximize the health benefits obtained whilst managing costs effectively. Now let's break down the main components of a cost-effectiveness evaluation. So the two main components are outcomes and costs. In terms of outcomes, these primarily include health benefits, which are the positive effects of the intervention, often measured in terms of life saved, or disease cases prevented, or improvements in health status, or quality of life. This is often assessed using measures like the quality adjusted life years, which we mentioned before, and the disability adjusted life years, which take into account both the quality and the quantity of life gained from the intervention. Technically, a cost-effectiveness analysis, which uses QALYs as outcomes, is called a cost-utility analysis. The other main component of a cost-effectiveness analysis is clearly cost. Costs can include direct costs, which are the immediate expenses related to the healthcare intervention assessed. They include costs for medical services, medications, hospital stay. And then there are indirect costs. Now, these are associated with loss of productivity due to illness or treatment, for instance. For example, the time of work for patients or caregivers. Now, this is often not included in cost-effectiveness evaluations, for some of them at least, such as the ones designed for health technology assessments. Another bucket of costs is intangible costs, which are included in some health economics evaluations, but rarely, if not ever, in cost-effectiveness evaluations. All cost-effectiveness evaluations culminate in what it's called an incremental cost-effectiveness ratio, or ICER. This is the key metric of cost-effectiveness analysis, which is calculated by dividing the total cost of an intervention by its health benefits. So the ratio helps compare the efficiency of different interventions by showing the cost per unit of health benefit, such as we mentioned before, the cost per QALY gained. Now let's explore a little more in detail QALYs and DALYs. So the ability to consistently describe the relative importance of diseases is important for public health decision making and planning. So summary measures of the burden of disease in a population are popular and widely used because they can simplify complex information about diseases, including risk factors, and the likelihood of resulting disability or other harms, morbidity, death, mortality. So health adjusted life years are the population health summary measures, which are typically used in estimates of the burden of disease. They measure the combined effects of mortality and morbidity in a population, allowing for comparisons across illnesses and interventions, as well as between populations. Two common approaches to measuring health adjusted life years are DALYs and QALYs. So DALYs, disability adjusted life years, are an absolute measure used to compare disease burden in population. The goal is to minimize the bad of gaps in health, keeping the value of DALYs as close to zero as possible. DALY measure the difference between the current state of the population health and an ideal situation. So where everyone reaches the age of standard life expectancy in perfect health. So DALYs are based on an assumption that time is the most appropriate measure for the burden of disease. The greater the time lived with a disability, or with a disability resulting in an illness or loss due to premature mortality, the greater the burden of disease is considered to be. So DALYs measure the total length of time that a specific illness is disabling to an individual over the course of their life. When applied to a population, they measure the total disability incurred due to a specific disease. Now, on the other hand, quality adjusted life years, or QALYs, as the name implies, measure both the quantity and the quality of life lived. So they are typically used to analyze cost effectiveness of clinical or public health interventions and for social welfare improvements. So the goal is to maximize the good of quality of life. So QALYs use weights between 0, which is death, and 1, which is perfect health. generated through different techniques. Because of their natures, QALYs can compare an intervention that helps prolong life but has serious side effects, for instance, such as permanent disability caused by radiation or chemotherapy, with an intervention that improves the quality of life without necessarily prolonging it. So palliative care, palliative pain management, for instance. Now, the QALY weighted value is not linked to any particular disease, and it takes into account different dimensions. This means that the QALY estimates are able to integrate psychosocial as well as biomedical aspects of the burden of disease. Now we'll look at one particular example of a cost effectiveness and then a comparison with a different methodology. Cardiovascular disease is one of the leading causes of non-communicable diseases, mortality and morbidity globally. The direct causal relationship between dietary salt intake or sodium chloride, blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease events such as ischemic heart disease and stroke is now well established. So to reduce dietary sodium, some countries have considered different policies to encourage food industry to substitute some of the sodium chloride with potassium chloride. In Vietnam, some experiments have demonstrated that low sodium in common seasonings, such as salt and bok can be produced, like some of these can be produced using potassium chloride. Now, these experiments also assess that these food products were then acceptable to consumers and therefore could be adopted with the consequences of lowering blood pressure, potentially. To assess the cost effectiveness of 3 alternative sodium reduction strategies in Vietnam to implement such a change, we developed a cost effectiveness model. Now, these strategies included the voluntary reduction of low sodium cooking salt, fish sauce, and bok can products, in addition to existing sodium rich products, without any government involvement. A government-supported campaign and the provision of a subsidy to participating manufacturers for replacing a portion of the sodium in cooking salt, bok can, and fish sauce with potassium. And then a legislation requiring all cooking salt, bok can, and fish sauce to have a portion of their sodium content replaced by potassium. Relatively to no intervention, all 3 of the sodium reduction programs assessed in the analysis were found to be dominant, which means less costly and more effective, which is the ideal place to be. Now, the voluntary sodium reduction strategy provided the smallest average cost reduction and average effectiveness benefit because it provided the lowest reduction in dietary sodium intake, and therefore the lowest reduction in ischemic heart disease or stroke risk. The regulatory strategy, on the other hand, was the least costly and the most cost-effective program scenario. This is due to the fact that no cost of salt substitution or media campaign would be sustained by the Vietnamese government, which was the main perspective of this analysis, but the mandatory nature of the legislation would translate to 100% population coverage and therefore a high effectiveness. Now, this research overall showed that any of the modeled programs would be a cost-effective strategy for the Vietnamese government in lowering blood pressure at a population level. And so that regardless of the strategy, this is a valuable intervention to implement. But at the same time, it also showed the government, depending on the level of investment they wanted to put in and the results they want to obtain, which would be the most cost-effective. Now, the second example that I want to show you is a different type of analysis. Now, this analysis aimed at assessing the economic value of implementing population-wide salt reduction programs, in this case in Fiji. In this case, we used a different methodology, which is more designed to demonstrate the value for money of healthcare and community funding decisions. So a previous project we conducted on the impact of salt reduction in Australia assessed the relationship between salt intake and downstream health and social effects, including reduction in stroke and coronary heart disease, as well as overall reduction in healthcare needs for informal care, and increased productivity. To develop the model, we used an impact assessment approach, meaning that we looked at the broader societal effects of the policy. Now, since accurate data on the salt reduction programs in Fiji was not available at the time of the analysis, the model we developed for Australia was adapted to calculate the threshold up to which a salt reduction program represents a valuable investment for the Fijian government. Again, based on expected reductions in stroke and coronary heart disease, reduced need for carers, and participation in the workforce.